Hello there. Today, I'd like you to join me for a softly spoken exploration of a Hollywood classic, The Wizard of Oz. In this talk, we're going to take a look at the iconic 1939 film that is beloved by young and old alike, and discover its history, the origins that inspired it, the people who were involved in its creation, and the incredible contribution it's made to popular culture since it was released. As usual, there'll be some images to illustrate our topic on the accompanying video, but there's no need for you to look at them if you don't want to. If you prefer, you can just close your eyes, relax, and let my voice guide you. So, welcome to the world of the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Let's begin by taking a look at the author who was responsible for creating the original book upon which the film was based. L Frank Baum was born in 1856, and he had a checkered career in theatre, journalism, and as a travelling salesman, before finding his forte with his first children's book, Mother Goose in Prose, which he published himself in 1897. The success of this book led him to begin writing the first of what would become a series of books about the magical land of Oz, and these best-selling tales brought Baum both critical acclaim and financial security. In total, he wrote 14 Oz books, but the first, and the most famous, was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. This story was first published in 1900, and it describes the amazing adventures of Dorothy Gale, a young Kansas farm girl who is swept away by a tornado into the land of Oz, along with her pet dog, Toto. The appealing story and instant success of this book quickly led to theatre adaptations, and Baum himself produced the first ever stage show of his own novel, a musical that opened in Chicago in 1902 and then transferred to Broadway. However, The Wizard of Oz was also considered to be perfect material for the new and exciting world of filmmaking, and 2 short, silent adaptations of it were made in 1908 and 1915 respectively. Another adaptation, this time with sound, was created in 1933 by the director Ted Eschbau, and, rather interestingly, this animated version also begins in sepia, while Dorothy is in Kansas, and then transforms into Technicolor once she reaches Oz. However, in spite of these early attempts to bring The Wizard of Oz to the screen, it wasn't until 1939 that MGM created the first full-length feature film of the story, and the classic that we know and love was born. In early 1938, when Louis B. Mayer decided that he wanted to commission the film for MGM, he had to buy the film rights to the book from Samuel Goldwyn, who had already snapped them up in 1934. Once Mayer had the rights, production quickly got underway, and several writers were asked to contribute treatments and scripts for the project. Some of these early scripts would have resulted in a very different kind of film. One, for example, wanted to turn the story into a broad, slapstick comedy, while another wrote out all of the magical elements entirely and replaced them with rather prosaic stereotypes, the Scarecrow becoming an ordinary man who was simply very stupid, and the Tin Man transforming into a criminal who had to wear a tin suit as punishment for his terrible crimes. One can imagine that, if this version of the script had come to fruition, the film might have sunk without a trace. However, although several writers did end up working on the script, the one who shaped it, and who ended up having the largest impact on the screenplay, was, very fortunately, Noel Langley. Langley was a South African novelist and playwright who had signed a 7-year script-writing contract with MGM in 1937. He'd been offered this job after the success of a children's novel he'd written in the previous year, called The Land of Green Ginger, a fantastical tale in which the son of Aladdin, he of the magic lamp, sets forth on a quest to discover a button-nosed tortoise and has many thrilling and magical adventures along the way. On a personal note, The Land of Green Ginger was one of my favourite books as a child, and The Wizard of Oz was one of my favourite films, and yet I had no idea that they were linked in this way, and it was only many, many years later that I discovered both of these childhood favourites of mine came from the pen of the same writer. One aspect of The Land of Green Ginger that overlaps very successfully with The Wizard of Oz is that, although most of the characters in the story are adults, they tend to exhibit an innocence and a naivety that is more conventionally associated with children. And, when applied to The Wizard of Oz, I think it's this trait that helps to make the screen versions of the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion so endearing. Noel Langley was also responsible for inventing many of the film's now iconic moments, such as Glinda the Good Witch arriving in a bubble, Toto the dog pulling back the curtain to reveal the wizard, the actors who play characters in Kansas doubling up for the characters in Oz, and, most importantly of all, the colour of Dorothy Gale's magic slippers changing from silver to ruby red. The reason for this latter change from the original book was in order to take advantage of the film's transition from sepia into glowing Technicolor. I still remember, as a very little girl, being completely blown away by the miraculous transformation from black and white to colour once Dorothy reaches Oz. Even though all the television and contemporary films of my childhood were made in colour, there was still something utterly thrilling and magical about seeing this old monochrome film suddenly light up in the most intense, vivid, and sparkling colours. The portrayal of Oz through this saturated palette was apparently taken very seriously by the MGM art department, and one anecdote tells of how it took them nearly a week to settle on the exact shade of yellow that should be used for the yellow brick road. Given this attention to the colourful details, Noel Langley's idea to change Dorothy's slippers from silver to red made perfect sense, and in the end, several pairs of glittering ruby red slippers would be made for the film. They were designed by MGM's chief costume designer and enduring style icon, Adrian. Adrian was responsible for the glamorous costumes in many Hollywood films, and for The Wizard of Oz, he originally created 2 alternative shoe designs, one of which had curling toes. However, the style that was eventually picked for the screen was based upon a pair of white silk pumps made by the Innis Shoe Company, which were then dyed red by the MGM costume department. To create the sparkling finish, the shoes were overlaid with georgette fabric, onto which sequins were applied by hand, with each pair of slippers requiring between 4,000 and 5,000 sequins. However, the famous bows on the shoe fronts were apparently only added to the design by Adrian 2 weeks before filming started, and each bow was decorated with bugle beads, 46 rose-coloured rhinestones, and 3 large red glass jewels. It's not known precisely how many pairs of these slippers were made for the film, but today 4 pairs are known to still exist, with 1 pair on display in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. While the ruby slippers would go on to become the stuff of legend, in 1938 the biggest question was, who was going to wear them? Early on in the project, both Shirley Temple and Diana Durbin, who were both very popular child stars at the time, were considered for the role of Dorothy. However, both Temple and Durbin were under contract to rival studios, and neither were available for the project. So MGM turned to a young contract player called Judy Garland, Garland had already been signed with the studio for 3 years by 1938, but her career was yet to really take off. Already in her mid-teens, she was considered too old to play child star roles, but also too short and too girl-next-door-ish to play grown-up glamour girl parts. And as young female stars at the time were boxed into one of these categories or the other, the studio didn't know what to do with Judy Garland. She had already starred alongside Diana Durbin in the 1936 short musical Every Sunday, in which Durbin was by far the biggest star, and she'd also begun to make a series of popular B-movie shorts with Mickey Rooney. However, a winning cameo in the film Broadway Melody of 1938, in which Judy famously sings "You Make Me Love You" as a love letter to Clark Gable, led to her star finally beginning to rise. A few months later, she was cast as Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz. This turned out to be a brilliant casting choice. With hindsight, it's hard to imagine that The Wizard of Oz would have been such a great film if little Shirley Temple had played Dorothy. And while Diana Durbin had a lot of endearing charm and natural screen charisma, her operatic soprano voice wouldn't have been so suited to the film's musical numbers. Judy Garland, with her low contralto voice and sensitive, empathetic delivery, was able to do full justice to Harold Arlen and Yip Harburg's songs, and her rendition of Over the Rainbow can still bring a tear to many people's eyes, mine included. When it came to casting the rest of the roles, the production was further blessed, or cursed, with casting difficulties that ultimately led to the ensemble we know and love today. Ray Bolger, Jack Haley, and Burt Lahr, who played the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion, were, like Judy Garland herself, all stalwarts of the vaudeville stage, and they brought exuberant physicality and sharp comic timing to their performances. However, in 1938, none of them were first-choice casting for the roles they eventually played. Ray Bolger was originally cast as the Tin Man, not the Scarecrow, and he had to petition the film's producer, Mervyn LeRoy, in order to be recast in the part he wanted. He did this by swapping roles with Buddy Ebsen, who was originally cast as the Scarecrow, but went along with the swap and became the Tin Man instead. This was a decision that he would come to regret, because early on in filming, Ebsen developed a severe allergic reaction to the aluminium body dust that was being used as the Tin Man's makeup, and he had to be rushed to hospital. Fortunately, he eventually recovered, but not in time to film The Wizard of Oz, and so Jack Haley stepped into the metal suit and became the Tin Man. Meanwhile, Burt Lahr, who was so marvellous in the film as the Cowardly Lion, was only cast after Louis B. Mayer had been talked out of using a real lion in the role. The final pieces of the central casting jigsaw were provided by Billy Burke as Glinda the Good Witch, Margaret Hamilton as the Wicked Witch of the West, and Frank Morgan as the Wizard. Today, many people only know of Billy Burke because of her role as Glinda, but in the 1930s, she was Hollywood royalty and was the first-choice casting for the role of the Good Witch. However, Frank Morgan was only offered the part of the Wizard because W.C. Fields wanted too much money to play the role, and Margaret Hamilton came on board at the very last minute after the original Wicked Witch actor, Gail Sondergaard, left the role quite suddenly. Sondergaard had been told that the witch would be a darkly glamorous character, very much in the style of the Wicked Queen in Walt Disney's Snow White, and some fascinating screen test photos for the part still exist that show her in a black sequined witch's hat and a matching sequined dress, fully made up and looking wickedly chic. However, once the studio decided that the Wicked Witch should be ugly, Sondergaard was forced to reshoot her screen test, and she was so appalled with the results that she declined to continue in the role. Again, with hindsight, perhaps this was a fortunate choice, Because not only did Margaret Hamilton turn out to be stupendously witchy, she also brought with her a memorably scary cackle, which would haunt the dreams of children for generations to come. However, even though the role turned her into an enduring Hollywood legend, Margaret Hamilton did perhaps have moments of regret about accepting the role of the Wicked Witch. The first problem she encountered was the green makeup that was used on her hands and face. This, like the original Tin Man makeup used on Buddy Ebsen, turned out to be toxic. Fortunately, Hamilton didn't develop such a severe allergic reaction to it, but it did make her feel so ill that she had to stick to a liquid diet while she was filming. And once the shoot was over, her skin retained a greenish tinge for many months afterwards. Even more seriously, Hamilton suffered second- and third-degree burns while filming her dramatic on-screen exit from Munchkinland, where she disappears in a ball of fire. Hidden by red smoke, she was supposed to exit through a trapdoor before the fiery explosion began, but during the second take of the scene, the trapdoor was delayed, and as a result, Hamilton also had to be hospitalized, requiring 6 weeks of recuperation before she could return to shoot the rest of the film. For all her on-set calamities, Margaret Hamilton wasn't the only person to suffer hazards while filming. Her stand-in, Betty Danko, also landed in hospital for 2 weeks after shooting a scene in which the Wicked Witch's broomstick unexpectedly exploded while Danko was still on it. Several of the actors who were playing the flying monkeys were also injured after the piano wires that were suspending them in the air snapped, while the entire cast and crew of the poppy field sequence was placed in particular danger because the artificial snow used in the scene was actually 100% industrial-grade asbestos. The Wicked Witch's broomstick and the Scarecrow's stuffing were also both made from asbestos, which is a virulent carcinogen. It's a wonder, really, that anyone made it off the set alive. The film was also plagued with creative problems, particularly over the issue of the director. The first person to take on the role was Richard Thorpe, but after 2 weeks of shooting, he was sacked by the producer, Mervyn LeRoy, who wanted to replace him with George Cukor, the multiple award-winning director who's now best remembered for such classics as The Philadelphia Story, The Women, Gaslight, A Star is Born, and My Fair Lady. Cukor wasn't able to commit to the project because he'd already signed up to shoot Gone with the Wind, which was being filmed at the same time as The Wizard of Oz. However, he did step in as a temporary director, and while he was there, he oversaw yet another fortuitous creative decision. Under Richard Thorpe's original direction, Judy Garland had been instructed to play Dorothy in an exaggerated baby doll way, and she'd been given a blonde wig and heavy makeup. When Cukor arrived on set, he got rid of the wig, pared the makeup right down, and encouraged Garland to simply be herself in front of the camera, resulting in the lovely, natural and engaging performance that we see in the finished film. The next full-time director on the production was Victor Fleming, who stuck with the creative changes that George Cukor had made and was responsible for directing most of the film. However, in a twist of irony, he too was eventually pulled from the project to direct Gone with the Wind, replacing Cukor after he had been sacked by the notoriously autocratic producer, David O. Selznick. Left without a director yet again, The Wizard of Oz was finally wrapped up under the guidance of King Vidor, who was assigned to finish filming the last few remaining scenes and to oversee post-production and reshoots. However, the film still continued to cause headaches. With a running time of nearly 2 hours, it was considered far too long for a 1930s audience, and so several of the song reprises were cut, as well as an entire musical number called The Jitterbug. Studio executives at MGM also wanted to cut Over the Rainbow. They argued that the song was too long and too complex for a children's film. And they even protested that it was degrading for Judy Garland to be seen singing in a barnyard. Both the associate producer, Arthur Freed, and the former director, Victor Fleming, petitioned the studio for the song to be kept in the finished edit. And thank goodness they did. The Wizard of Oz premiered at Grauman's Chinese Theatre in Hollywood on the 15th of August, 1939, and it opened nationwide 10 days later. There's an urban myth that the film was a financial and critical flop when it was first released, but that's not entirely true. Although it did initially record a loss, this was only because the film had cost so much to make. $2.7 million, which, at the time, made it the most expensive film that MGM had ever produced. But although the box office takings didn't quite cover these expenses, once promotional costs had been added in, it did take in over $3 million in its opening run, which, given that the average price of an American cinema ticket was then 23 cents, translates to quite a few bums on seats. The film was a particular success in Europe, and it was also generally well received by critics. The New York Times called it a delightful piece of wonderworking, and added that, not since Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs has anything quite so fantastic succeeded half so well. Meanwhile, Variety claimed that some of the scenic passages are so beautiful in design and composition as to stir audiences by their sheer unfoldment. While the film had been beleaguered in production and had initially failed to break even on release, it would go on to become the most watched film of all time. A re-release at the cinema in 1949 was a huge success, and when CBS premiered it on television in 1956, 44 million people tuned in to watch it. However, the ultimate success of The Wizard of Oz can perhaps be measured most accurately by the impact it's left on popular culture. The leading cast members of the film quickly turned into Hollywood legends. The Arlen and Yip songs became instant classics, and many lines from the script, such as, "Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain," "I've a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore," and "I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too," have entered into society's collective consciousness. Over the decades, dialogue, imagery, and music from the film have been co-opted for political protests, journalism, pop songs, fashion collections, and a host of advertisements, while Judy Garland's performance as Dorothy Gale has made her a beloved LGBTQ icon. There have also been several film, theatre, and TV adaptations, sequels, and riffs made on the story in the years since the film was released. These heavily reference the 1939 musical, but reinterpret it in different ways. The stage musical Wicked, the Disney films Return to Oz and Oz the Great and Powerful, the 1970s disco musical The Wiz, and the not at all for children David Lynch film Wild at Heart. For me, however, all these many interpretations and variations only serve to underline the genius of the original film. I can still remember my feelings the very first time I watched it on the television as a very small child, loving the Cowardly Lion, wanting to be Dorothy, being frightened of the witch and the flying monkeys, and, weirdly, being absolutely petrified of the talking trees who throw their apples at Dorothy and her friends. In my sitting room, there's a life-size cardboard cutout of Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion, and like many other people across the world, I know all the lyrics to Over the Rainbow, have been known to warble If I Only Had a Brain in the bath, and frequently catch myself humming along to the tune of Optimistic Voices. For a film that was beset by so many problems during its production, The Wizard of Oz has turned into one of the greatest triumphs in Hollywood history, and its joyful performances, witty dialogue, heartwarming themes, inspiring songs, sparkling costumes, and ravishing colour all combine to make it a magical and enduring gift to humanity. That brings us to the end of our talk about The Wizard of Oz, and I do hope you've enjoyed exploring the history of this wonderful film with me. I hope, too, that you'll be able to join me again soon for another ASMR adventure. Until then, thank you for your company. Goodbye.